The polished marble floors of Boston luxury motors gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, reflecting the grandeur of a world reserved for the powerful elite. Exotic cars lined the showroom, each one a shimmering monument to status and wealth. Into this opulence stepped a young black girl, Alexis Carter, dressed in a simple school uniform and worn sneakers. Heads turned, conversations paused. The showroom's lead sales manager, Blake Thompson, wasted no time. His gaze swept over her, cold and dismissive, before he approached with a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Excuse me," Blake said, voice dripping with condescension. "You might be looking for somewhere a little more affordable." Laughter rippled softly among the staff and customers. Heat flushed Alexis's cheeks, but she remained composed. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the exit, her dignity intact, but her heart pounding with silent rage. Behind her, Blake and his colleagues chuckled, convinced they had rid themselves of an unworthy distraction. None of them realized the humiliation they just inflicted would soon unleash consequences far beyond their control. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The glass doors of Boston luxury motors whispered shut behind Alexis Carter, sealing her out with a final, almost mocking sigh. The morning sun caught the tears brimming in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her fingers tightened into fists inside the pockets of her worn blazer as she took one step after another, leaving behind the cold walls that had judged her so mercilessly. Inside the showroom, Blake Thompson adjusted his tie, a smug grin pulling at his mouth. Around him, the subtle chuckles and amused glances continued. Employees went back to polishing cars that cost more than most families' homes, whispering among themselves about kids who don't know their place. Customers, draped in designer fabrics, barely concealed their satisfaction at the orderliness being restored. No unsightly reminders that not everyone belonged to their world. Out on the sidewalk, Alexis inhaled deeply. The cold Boston air bit into her skin, sharp and bracing, anchoring her resolve. She could still hear Blake's mocking voice echoing in her mind, every syllable slicing deeper into the walls of her pride. "You might be looking for somewhere a little more affordable." Each word pressed against her ribs like a weight she could not shed. Alexis turned her head slightly, allowing herself one final glance through the dealership's pristine windows. Inside, they had already forgotten her. She was invisible again, another shadow brushed aside by indifference. Her heart pounded, not from shame, but from the violent storm of fury she forced herself to suppress. She remembered the lessons her father had taught her since childhood. How dignity is not something that can be taken from you unless you surrender it. "Hold your head high, even when they try to bend your spine," Marcus Carter would say. And so Alexis lifted her chin, standing straighter than she ever had. No words of protest had passed her lips inside the dealership. No angry tears, no accusations hurled. Instead, she had chosen the hardest path. Silence. Silent endurance that burned hotter than any outburst ever could. She walked back to her modest sedan, a car her father had given her not for status, but for practicality and independence. She climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door gently, and sat motionless for several minutes. Every heartbeat reverberated through her, louder and louder, until it became the only sound she could hear. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She wrote. Pulling a leather-bound notebook from her bag, Alexis opened to a fresh page and carefully documented everything. The time she entered the dealership, the cars on display, the names on the name tags, the sequence of events, the expressions on the employees' faces, the laughter that followed. Every detail, every injustice, pinned down, black ink on white paper, where they could no longer be denied. She wrote not because she wanted revenge, but because she refused to let the truth vanish unrecorded. When she finally finished, Alexis sat back and stared out at the busy street. Luxury vehicles purred past her in a steady stream, the kind of lives people assumed she had no place touching. But Alexis knew something they didn't. The true weight of a person was never measured by the leather on their seats or the gold on their wrists. It was measured by the quiet strength they carried when the world tried to strip them bare. Inside the dealership, Blake congratulated himself on another disruption swiftly handled. His laughter was light, but beneath it stirred a lazy contempt that had hardened over years of unchallenged assumptions. He didn't need to say it aloud to feel justified. A black girl in a tattered school uniform had no business breathing the same air as his elite clients. And yet, if he had looked closer, if he had paused to truly see the girl he had so carelessly dismissed, he might have noticed something he had never encountered before. An unshakable calm rooted not in ignorance, but in an ironclad sense of self-worth. Alexis wasn't fragile, she was tempered. As she drove away from the glittering facade of Boston Luxury Motors, Alexis didn't promise herself vengeance. She promised herself vindication, not through shouting matches or public spectacle, but through the relentless, unyielding assertion of her dignity. She would not be erased, not by Blake Thompson, not by the judgmental stares that had sought to reduce her to nothing more than a wayward girl dreaming above her station. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the leather cool against her palms. She was her father's daughter. She knew how to fight battles not with fury, but with precision. What Blake Thompson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he had just humiliated the daughter of one of the most powerful tech magnates in America. And by tomorrow, the arrogance that had led him to underestimate a simple girl in sneakers would cost him far more than he could imagine. But Alexis wouldn't have to lift a finger. The world had its own way of correcting those who mistook humility for weakness. The morning sun barely crept over the skyline when Alexis sat across the kitchen island from her father, Marcus Carter. He wore his usual casual attire, a soft gray sweater and dark jeans, the kind of outfit that betrayed nothing of the empire he commanded from the top floors of Carter Innovations, one of the most powerful tech conglomerates in the world. His eyes, however, held the quiet authority of a man who had conquered 1,000 battles without ever raising his voice. Alexis pushed her notebook toward him silently, letting the carefully written pages speak for her. Marcus read every line without interrupting. Not a flicker of emotion crossed his face. No flash of anger, no sudden sigh of disappointment. He simply absorbed it, word by word, injustice by injustice, until he gently closed the notebook and looked up at his daughter. "You did well," he said finally, his voice low and even. Alexis blinked, surprised. She had expected outrage, a demand to rush to the dealership and unleash his full legal might. But Marcus Carter had never been a man of reckless explosions. His victories were patient, calculated, and absolute. "You didn't lower yourself to their level," he continued, folding his hands thoughtfully. "You preserved your dignity. That's the kind of strength they can never touch." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Marcus gave her a small, proud smile, one that softened the sharp lines of his face. "They think they humiliated you," he said, "but in truth they've humiliated themselves. And tomorrow they will learn exactly what kind of mistake they've made." For a brief moment, Alexis allowed herself to relax, to feel the safety that had wrapped around her since childhood. A safety not built on privilege, but on unshakable resilience. Marcus Carter had not been born into wealth, far from it. As a boy, he had grown up on the rougher edges of Chicago's South Side, raised by a single mother who cleaned offices at night and studied during the day to earn her teaching degree. Money was scarce, opportunity even scarcer. But from a young age, Marcus had recognized that real power wasn't about having the right clothes or the right last name. It was about discipline, about relentless self-betterment, about refusing to let the world define you by your circumstances. At 14, the same age Alexis was now, Marcus had built his first computer from scavenged parts. By 18, he had won a full scholarship to MIT. And by 30, he had founded Carter Innovations, a company that would revolutionize renewable energy technology and quietly amass one of the largest personal fortunes in America. But despite the vast wealth at his fingertips, Marcus had insisted on raising Alexis with the same core values that had carried him through the fire: simplicity, self-respect, purpose beyond personal gain. Their home, though spacious and elegant, lacked the ostentatious displays favored by other billionaires. No fleets of sports cars, no private zoo, no marble statues. Instead, the walls were lined with books, and the backyard hosted community gatherings where neighbors, regardless of income or background, were always welcome. Alexis had never been handed privilege on a silver platter. She had been taught to earn everything. From her grades to her summer internships to the scholarship fund she was quietly building to support underprivileged students, which made yesterday's humiliation all the more bitter, not because it bruised her pride, but because it reminded her, viscerally, painfully, that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how pure your intentions, some people would always judge you by the color of your skin and the cut of your clothes before they ever looked you in the eyes. Marcus reached out and gently placed a hand over hers. "You're not alone in this," he said, "and you're not powerless." Alexis met his gaze, feeling the strength that radiated from him, a strength she had inherited, even if it was still new and raw within her. "What are we going to do?" she asked quietly. Marcus's smile deepened, slow and deliberate. "We're going to teach them a lesson they'll never forget, not through rage, not through lawsuits, but through undeniable truth." He rose from his seat, walking toward the window where morning light spilled into the kitchen. For a long moment, he simply stood there, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the city skyline, as if weighing it in his mind. "We don't scream to be heard," he said finally. "We move so powerfully, so unmistakably, that the world has no choice but to listen." Alexis stood as well, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a fierce sense of purpose. Tomorrow, when Marcus Carter's Rolls-Royce Phantom glided into Boston Luxury Motors, it wouldn't just be a car arriving. It would be a reckoning. The dealership that had so casually dismissed a young black girl in a worn school uniform would be forced to look beyond the surface, to confront the deep, festering rot in their assumptions about who deserved respect and who did not. And standing at the center of it all would be Alexis Carter, no longer a silent target of their contempt, but the embodiment of a truth they could neither deny nor erase. Because the greatest power wasn't in what you wore or what you drove, it was in who you chose to be when the world tried to tell you you were nothing. And Alexis had already made her choice. Boston Luxury Motors prided itself on appearances. Gleaming floors, immaculate windows, polished leather seats. But beneath the showroom's shining surface, the rot was deeply entrenched, woven into the very fabric of its culture like mold hidden behind a flawless coat of paint. It wasn't simply Blake Thompson's arrogance that had poisoned the environment. It was the entire system. The dealership had been built on silent assumptions. Assumptions about who belonged and who didn't, about who deserved attention and who could be ignored. From the hiring practices to the way customers were greeted, or not, the biases were so deeply embedded that no one even needed to say them aloud anymore. They pulsed invisibly through every interaction, a current of silent prejudice cloaked in the language of professionalism and customer vetting. When Alexis had walked in, it wasn't just Blake who had judged her. It was the receptionist who had barely glanced up from her desk. It was the other sales associates who had snickered behind polished counters. It was the wealthy clientele who had watched the scene unfold without a word of protest. No one had needed to conspire. The machine operated flawlessly without explicit orders. It was an elegant system of exclusion. Smooth, efficient, devastating. Blake Thompson, of course, had mastered it. To him, judgment wasn't cruelty, it was just good business. Identify the whales, humor their whims, discard the rest. If someone didn't wear the right watch, speak with the right accent, or walk with the right air of entitlement, they were quietly ushered out of sight like unwanted clutter. He wasn't unique. He was just an excellent student of a broken system. Over the years, the dealership's unwritten rules had hardened into an unchallengeable code. Smile wider for the white customers. Assume wealth from tailored suits and Rolexes. Question legitimacy if the skin tone was darker, the clothes simpler. Hide contempt behind a velvet curtain of policy and procedure. No handbook had taught Blake these things. No manager had needed to say them. He had absorbed them like a second language, spoken fluently in every approving glance he received from colleagues, every unspoken reward for weeding out the wrong crowd. When Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, walked the showroom floor, He didn't scold Blake for quietly discouraging certain visitors. If anything, he praised the month's high sales numbers, never asking how many promising customers had been driven away simply because they didn't look the part. Profit, not principle, ruled the day. And so when Blake had humiliated Alexis, he wasn't stepping out of line. He was reinforcing the invisible boundaries that everyone had silently agreed to maintain. But the most dangerous rot wasn't even in the open mockery or the condescension. It was in the indifference. No one had intervened. No one had said, maybe she deserves a chance. No one had pulled Blake aside and said, you're wrong. Because in their world, Alexis didn't exist as a full person. She existed as a disruption, a reminder of an inconvenient truth, that dignity and worth were not confined to wealth or whiteness. She shattered the carefully curated illusion, and illusions, once cracked, must either be repaired or abandoned entirely. The employees chose to repair the illusion, reinforcing it with whispered jokes, sidelong glances, a fortress of smug superiority. They didn't realize the foundation was already crumbling beneath their feet. Across town, as Marcus Carter finalized his quiet plan, the system's downfall was being engineered, not through fiery speeches or public protests, but through the surgical application of undeniable truth. Because when corruption is exposed under enough light, it doesn't burn dramatically. It decays from within, collapsing under the weight of its own rot. Inside Boston Luxury Motors, signs of that decay had already begun to show. Customer reviews had started to slip. Subtle complaints about cold receptions, rushed tours, inattentive service. Several promising young employees, people who didn't fit the mold, had quietly left over the past year, tired of the unspoken discrimination they faced from both customers and management. Even longtime clients had begun noticing the atmosphere, a brittle, hollow glamour that couldn't fully disguise the discomfort that lingered beneath the luxury. Blake never noticed. Richard Mason chose not to notice, but the cracks were widening. When Marcus Carter's Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up the next day, it would do more than expose Blake's prejudice. It would reveal an entire institution built on assumptions that could no longer survive scrutiny. It wasn't merely about Alexis Carter. It was about every person who had ever been turned away, dismissed, diminished, because of a detail as irrelevant as the color of their skin or the simplicity of their clothes. And when the collapse came, it would not be because of a single act of cruelty. It would be because the entire system had mistaken temporary comfort for lasting strength. Marcus Carter didn't need to destroy them. They had already begun destroying themselves. All he had to do was hold up a mirror and make sure the world was watching when they saw their reflection. Now, Daniel Miller had always known something was wrong at Boston Luxury Motors. He had seen it in the way Blake Thompson's smile would tighten when certain customers walked in. A calculated courtesy, clipped and mechanical, reserved for those who didn't fit the dealership's silent criteria. He had seen it in how colleagues would exchange glances, soft chuckles rippling when a wrong-type customer dared to admire the million-dollar machines lined up like trophies behind glass. But Daniel had told himself it wasn't his fight. Fresh out of college, desperate for experience, he had clung to his job like a lifeline. Keep your head down, follow orders, don't rock the boat. These were the lessons Daniel learned quickly, lessons that quietly poisoned his early ambitions of doing honest, respectable work. Yet when Alexis Carter walked into the showroom that day, something inside Daniel stirred uncomfortably. He had watched from behind a polished McLaren as Blake approached her, that familiar smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. He had seen the dismissal, heard the condescension, and though every fiber of his being had screamed to intervene, Daniel had stood frozen, trapped by fear. Fear of losing his job, fear of retaliation, fear of standing alone. After Alexis was driven out, Daniel hadn't been able to meet his own eyes in the mirror. He had rationalized it at first, told himself that it wasn't his place, that maybe it was a misunderstanding, that she would be fine. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had witnessed injustice and chosen silence. And silence, he now realized, was complicity. When Marcus Carter returned the next day, the atmosphere in the showroom shifted with almost supernatural force. Every employee could feel it. The change in temperature, the heaviness in the air. This wasn't an ordinary customer. This was judgment walking through their doors. Daniel watched as Blake, ever oblivious, strutted forward to greet Marcus with his trademark arrogance, only for his confidence to shatter piece by piece under the billionaire's cold gaze. Then came the words that changed everything. "The person you humiliated yesterday is my daughter." The color drained from Blake's face. The room fell into paralyzed silence. And Daniel felt something inside him snap. For too long he had swallowed his voice, told himself it wasn't his problem. But watching Blake squirm, watching the truth hover just out of reach, Daniel realized this was the moment that would define him, not just as an employee, but as a human being. Heart pounding, palms sweating, Daniel stepped forward. "Mr. Carter is absolutely right," he said, his voice cutting through the thick silence. Every head in the room turned. Blake's eyes widened, flashing with panic and rage. Daniel could feel his heart thudding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it, but he pressed on. "I saw everything yesterday. Alexis Carter came here with respect and sincerity. She deserved to be treated like any other customer. Instead, she was mocked, dismissed, humiliated, simply because of how she looked." For a moment, it felt like the world stopped turning. Blake hissed under his breath, "Daniel, shut up!" Zerania, but Daniel didn't flinch. He had lived too long in quiet shame. He wasn't going to live another day like that. "It wasn't just a mistake," Daniel continued, voice growing stronger. "It was a pattern, a culture, one we all allowed to fester." A few of the other employees shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. Daniel turned to Marcus Carter, who regarded him not with anger, but with a measured, steady gaze. A gaze that didn't just see him, but recognized him. "I'm sorry it took me so long to speak up," Daniel said, "but I won't stay silent anymore." In that instant, Daniel understood the full weight of the question he had avoided for so long. What will you do when faced with injustice? He had his answer now. He would stand, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences, because dignity wasn't just something you demanded for yourself. It was something you defended for others, especially when it wasn't easy. And if it cost him his job, so be it. There were worse things than unemployment. There was living with the knowledge that you had been a coward when someone needed you to be brave. In the hours that followed Daniel's courageous stand, the walls of Boston Luxury Motors seemed to tighten and groan under the pressure of an unseen force. Something had shifted, permanently. The invisible current of prejudice that had long flowed beneath the polished marble floors was no longer invisible. It was exposed, raw, undeniable. And now it had to be confronted. Marcus Carter's parting words had been a warning, not just to Blake Thompson, but to every single person who had allowed the rot to flourish. "The consequences," Marcus had said, "are already here." Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, knew he had a crisis on his hands. A crisis bigger than damaged reputations or bad press. This was existential. It wasn't just that Marcus Carter was a billionaire with an army of legal firepower. It was that the story, a story of blatant, documented discrimination, was starting to spread. Whispers among clients, uncomfortable questions from corporate partners, emails from journalists who had caught wind of a potential scandal. Boston Luxury Motors, once a shrine to exclusivity and prestige, was now dangerously close to being seen as a monument to bigotry. And Daniel Miller, the junior salesman no one had ever taken seriously, had become the unlikely spark for change. But Daniel didn't stop at speaking up. When Marcus left the dealership that day, Daniel found himself standing alone in the showroom, heart still hammering in his chest. Blake had stormed into his office, slamming the door so hard the walls seemed to shake. The other employees had scattered like startled birds, afraid to get caught in the crossfire. Yet Daniel remained, because deep down he knew words alone weren't enough. Change would require action, evidence, allies. By the time night fell, Daniel had already made his decision. He stayed late, long after the last client had left, and quietly gathered what he could. He documented text messages, snide comments from Blake about vetting certain customers. He screenshotted internal chat logs, jokes made at the expense of minority clients. He printed sales records. noting the startling disparities in how certain customers were treated and prioritized. Each file was a puzzle piece. Each piece, when assembled, told a devastating truth. The discrimination wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, systemic and deliberate. Daniel didn't know what exactly he would do with it yet, but he knew he had to be ready because the storm was coming. And when it broke, he didn't want to just be a witness. He wanted to be the proof. The next morning, Daniel wasn't alone. Word had spread quietly among the staff. Not everyone supported Blake's conduct. Not really. There were others, like Daniel, who had kept their heads down for fear of losing their jobs, who had swallowed their discomfort under the weight of necessity. Now, emboldened by Daniel's example, they started to step forward. First came Linda, a finance associate, who whispered to Daniel near the coffee machine, "I've seen the way they treat certain customers. I just didn't think anyone would listen if I spoke up." Then David, a mechanic, approached him in the parking lot. "If you need someone to back you up, I'm with you." By lunchtime, they had quietly formed an unlikely coalition, a handful of employees who refused to pretend any longer that they hadn't seen what they had seen. Together, they created a timeline of incidents. Together, they pieced together the full, damning story. Daniel could feel the momentum building like a rising tide. Yet with momentum came danger. Blake wasn't stupid. By midday, he sensed that something was brewing, though he couldn't quite pin it down. His anger sharpened into paranoia. He snapped at employees. He barked orders about protecting the dealership's image. He muttered threats about tightening loyalty and weeding out troublemakers. But it was too late. The machine he had depended on, the silent complicity, the shared cowardice, was no longer working. The gears were grinding, seizing up under the strain of newfound conscience. The gathering storm was not just outside of Boston Luxury Motors. It was rising within its own walls. And at its center stood Daniel Miller, no longer the timid junior salesman, but a force the old guard could neither intimidate nor dismiss. In the early evening, after the dealership had closed, Daniel stood alone in the center of the silent showroom. The polished floors reflected the gleaming cars, Ferraris, Bentleys, Lamborghinis. But Daniel no longer saw beauty in them. He saw the illusion, the fragility of a system built on exclusion, now crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. He pulled out his phone, his hands steady, attached the files, wrote a careful factual cover letter, and sent them directly to Marcus Carter's office. No sensationalism, no exaggeration, just the truth. Hard, cold, unarguable. As he pressed send, Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the storm crest at his back. There would be fallout. There would be fear. But there would also be, for the first time in a long time, hope. Because real change never starts with an army. It starts with one person, one voice, refusing to stay silent. And Daniel had made his choice. 3 days after Daniel Miller sent the files to Marcus Carter, Boston Luxury Motors received a formal notice. An emergency meeting had been called. Mandatory attendance. No exceptions. At 10 a.m. sharp, the boardroom, usually reserved for celebrating record sales and entertaining wealthy clients, was filled with tension so thick it seemed to choke the very air. Richard Mason sat stiffly at the head of the gleaming oak table, his face pale, sweat beading at his temples. Blake Thompson, arms crossed tightly over his chest, wore a sneer so brittle it looked ready to crack apart. The other department heads, normally full of polished arrogance, sat in uneasy silence, casting furtive glances at one another. And then the doors opened. Marcus Carter entered without fanfare, wearing a dark tailored suit, simple but impeccable. His daughter Alexis Carter followed close behind, her chin high, her gaze steady. Flanking them were two attorneys, their expressions grave but composed. Marcus didn't bother with greetings. He moved to the end of the table, placed a single folder on the polished surface, and stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of his presence settle over the room. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, deadly quiet. "Before we begin," Marcus said, "understand this. I am not here as a customer. I am not here as a businessman seeking resolution. I am here as a father whose daughter was humiliated, dehumanized, and publicly insulted by your institution. Blake shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Richard cleared his throat, but Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off without a glance. "Save your apologies," Marcus said. "I'm not interested in empty words." He tapped the folder lightly. "What I have here are records, witness testimonies, digital communications, surveillance footage, enough evidence to destroy this dealership's reputation permanently." A cold wave rippled through the room. Blake's smugness wavered visibly now, his face paling. Richard swallowed hard. Marcus leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with Richard, then Blake, his voice sharpening. "This isn't about one bad day. It's about a culture, one that you allowed to fester, one that judged my daughter not by her actions, not by her character, but by her skin color and the clothes she wore." He straightened again, folding his hands neatly behind his back. "I could ruin you today," he continued. "With a press release, a single call to my legal team, I could drag Boston Luxury Motors through a media firestorm so severe that you'd be lucky to sell a used bicycle by the end of the year." Blake finally snapped, his voice cracking. "It wasn't like that. We didn't know who she was." Marcus's gaze turned to ice. "Exactly," he cut in, his voice a whip crack. "You didn't know, and that's the point. If she were just an ordinary black girl, you would have continued treating her like she was nothing. Because in your eyes, that's all she was." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard slumped slightly in his chair, his face gray. Blake opened his mouth again, but Marcus fixed him with a look so cold, so cutting, that the words died before they could leave his throat. Marcus turned to Daniel, who stood quietly at the far end of the room, shoulders squared. "Daniel Miller," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly, "had the courage to tell the truth, when it mattered, even knowing the risk." Daniel gave a small nod, the faintest tremor of nerves in his hands, but he stood tall. Marcus addressed the room again. "Change begins with courage, not with polished smiles or hollow slogans, with real action, real accountability." He stepped aside, allowing Alexis to move forward. She looked at the men seated before her, the ones who had laughed, who had sneered, and spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "I don't want pity," Alexis said, "and I don't want revenge. I want this place to change. I want no one else to ever feel what I felt when I walked through those doors. Invisible, disrespected, unwanted." The room remained frozen as her words cut through it like a blade. Then Marcus spoke once more, his voice final, absolute. "Effective immediately, Blake Thompson is terminated from his position. His conduct is irredeemable." Blake jolted upright, face flushing deep red. "You can't fire me without cause," he barked, desperation seeping into his voice. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "We have cause, and if you wish to pursue legal action, I would strongly advise you to reconsider, unless you want your entire record of misconduct made public." Blake slumped back into his chair, defeated. It was over, and he knew it. Marcus turned to Richard Mason. "As for you, Mr. Mason," he said, voice low, "Boston Luxury Motors will survive if you have the courage to rebuild it from the ground up. New leadership, new policies, mandatory anti-discrimination training, real reform, not just for optics, but because it is the right thing to do." Richard nodded weakly, his eyes glassy with humiliation and fear. Marcus gave him a final nod, then turned back to Daniel. "Daniel Miller will be promoted to Director of Customer Relations and Diversity," Marcus announced. A gasp rippled through the room. "Because he understands something that cannot be taught by title or paycheck," Marcus said. "He understands human dignity." Daniel stood, stunned, but Marcus offered him a small, approving smile. The confrontation was over, but the battle for change had only just begun. As Marcus and Alexis exited the boardroom, heads held high, the storm they had unleashed continued to thunder silently behind them. Boston Luxury Motors had been cracked open, and now it was up to those left behind to decide whether they would rebuild or let the rot consume them entirely. The collapse didn't come with a deafening crash. It came in slow, devastating waves, each one eroding the once impenetrable facade of Boston Luxury Motors, until only ruins remained. The morning after the confrontation, news broke. Not through official channels and not through press releases. It began as whispers. A single social media post, blurry footage captured by a customer during Alexis Carter's humiliation, shared with a caption that sliced through polished lies like a razor. Imagine being treated like garbage at a luxury dealership, just because of how you look. The video went viral within hours. By noon, major news outlets had picked up the story. Billionaire's daughter publicly humiliated at prestigious dealership. Discrimination scandal rocks Boston. By evening, Boston Luxury Motors was trending worldwide. Comment sections flooded with outrage. Former customers came forward, sharing eerily similar stories of being belittled, ignored, dismissed, all buried until now under layers of polite facades. Blake Thompson's name surfaced almost immediately, tied irrevocably to the scandal. Photos of him smirking at the showroom leaked internal messages laden with bias, all laid bare for the world to see. There was no spinning it. No amount of PR apologies could undo what had been unleashed. Inside the dealership, panic reigned. Richard Mason, once so composed and smug, now found himself pacing his office like a caged animal, barking frantic orders into his phone. Call our attorneys, issue a statement, offer discounts, do something. But it was useless. Customers canceled orders en masse. Luxury brands that once clamored for Boston, luxury motors to carry their vehicles, began pulling out. Corporate partners severed ties overnight. The financial bloodletting was immediate and brutal. Sales collapsed by 70% in a matter of days. Contracts were withdrawn. Reputation, once the crown jewel of the dealership, lay in tatters. Richard held emergency meetings, but the staff barely listened anymore. The ones who had once laughed alongside Blake now whispered behind Richard's back, scrambling to update resumes, desperate to escape a sinking ship. Meanwhile, Blake himself disappeared, resigned in disgrace, hiding from the media storm he had unleashed upon himself. Paparazzi camped outside his apartment. Old college acquaintances sold humiliating stories about him to tabloids. Every cruel remark he had ever uttered became public property. The once proud king of Boston Luxury Motors was now a national symbol of arrogant failure. But the collapse wasn't just external. Inside the dealership, something deeper broke. For years, the staff had operated under an unspoken code: judge silently, smile politely, pretend everything was fine. Now that poisonous silence was gone, replaced by suspicion, regret, and a gnawing sense of collective guilt. Meetings that once buzzed with smug confidence turned into graveyards of forced apologies and awkward silences. New customers trickled in, lured by steep discounts, but they came armed with questions, with suspicion, scrutinizing every interaction for signs of prejudice. Salespeople fumbled. Managers flailed. Boston Luxury Motors no longer sold prestige. It sold shame, and no amount of glossy advertising could cover that up. Meanwhile, Daniel Miller, once overlooked, once dismissed, quietly rose to lead. He implemented new mandatory training programs. He brought in diversity consultants. He created anonymous reporting systems for discrimination complaints. But Daniel knew, policy alone wouldn't save the dealership. What had been broken wasn't just rules, it was trust. And trust had to be rebuilt one grueling conversation, one sincere apology, one act of humility at a time. Richard Mason reluctantly stood beside Daniel at these training sessions, grim-faced, knowing that survival meant surrendering the old ways completely. In private, Richard grappled with crushing regret. He thought of the years he had spent curating an exclusive, elitist image, only to realize too late that exclusivity without integrity was a house of cards. A single breath of truth had toppled it all. For the employees who stayed, those who truly wanted change, the process was excruciating. Facing past behavior, owning up to silent complicity, learning how deep their biases ran. But some, like Linda and David, embraced the challenge. Slowly, painfully, the dealership began to shift. No more judging by designer shoes or skin color. No more whispered jokes behind polished smiles. Each customer who walked through the doors was greeted the same, with dignity, with respect. It wasn't perfect. Mistakes still happened, but now mistakes were acknowledged and corrected rather than buried. It was as if the soul of Boston Luxury Motors, long corroded by arrogance, was being stripped bare and rebuilt, brick by humble brick. Outside, the media frenzy eventually subsided. The world moved on to new scandals. But inside, the lessons remained like scars, permanent and necessary. Months later, Marcus Carter quietly visited the dealership, unannounced. He walked through the showroom, observing silently. He saw a young Latina woman browsing the Rolls-Royce section, treated with genuine attentiveness. He saw an elderly black couple test driving a Porsche, assisted warmly by a new recruit. He saw Daniel in the corner, patiently explaining financing options to a middle-class family who looked utterly out of place among the marble floors, yet were treated as if they were the most important clients in the world. Marcus smiled faintly. The collapse had been brutal, but sometimes things must be torn down completely before they can be built back the right way. As he exited quietly, no one recognized him. No one rushed to offer special treatment, and that, Marcus thought, was perhaps the greatest sign of all, that real change had finally taken root. 6 months later, Boston Luxury Motors bore little resemblance to the gilded temple of arrogance it once was. The dealership had been gutted, not just in reputation, but in spirit. And now, from those ruins, something new, something fragile but real, was beginning to rise. The rebirth wasn't flashy. It didn't come with grand marketing campaigns or desperate rebranding efforts. It came slowly, quietly, through everyday acts of humility, consistency, and a relentless commitment to transformation. At the heart of it stood Daniel Miller. Promoted to Director of Customer Relations and Diversity, Daniel understood the monumental task before him, not just to fix policies, but to change the very culture that had allowed prejudice to thrive. He started with education, real, uncomfortable, ongoing education. Weekly workshops were mandatory. Staff underwent rigorous training in unconscious bias, inclusive service practices, and cultural competency. But Daniel knew lectures wouldn't be enough. He wanted transformation that lived in muscle memory, that became as natural as breathing. So he initiated perspective days, monthly immersions where employees volunteered at shelters, community centers, and local nonprofits. They served meals, mentored at-risk youth, visited underfunded schools. Slowly, cracks formed in the old armor of elitism. Salespeople who once sneered at modest shoes now knelt on scuffed floors to help elderly clients understand financing options. And managers who once judged customers by the cut of their suits now listened, deeply and attentively, to every story that walked through their doors. Boston Luxury Motors learned to see people, truly see them, not as price tags or status symbols, but as individuals worthy of respect. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, employees who couldn't adjust and quietly resigned, missteps that required public apologies, growing pains that strained nerves and tested patience. But through it all, Daniel led with steady hands and an open heart. He created spaces for honest conversations about race, privilege, and accountability. He recognized the employees who embodied the new values, not just in words, but in actions. And he made it clear, Boston Luxury Motors' rebirth would not be measured by quarterly profits. It would be measured by trust. Meanwhile, Richard Mason underwent a transformation of his own. The once proud owner, who had built his empire on exclusivity, was humbled by the storm he had survived. No longer the distant figurehead, Richard now attended every training session alongside his staff. He listened more than he spoke. He learned, slowly, painfully, that leadership wasn't about projecting power. It was about building respect. Richard began to sponsor scholarships for underprivileged youth interested in automotive careers. He funded free community workshops on financial literacy and car ownership basics. He realized that true prestige didn't come from shutting people out. It came from lifting people up. Among the staff, a quiet camaraderie blossomed. Veteran employees like Linda and David, once skeptical, became champions of the new culture. They mentored new hires, shared their own journeys of change, and celebrated every small victory. Boston Luxury Motors no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a place of opportunity. Clients noticed, too. Word spread that something had changed, something real. New customers arrived, young entrepreneurs, working-class families, retirees. Not all of them wore designer shoes or carried platinum cards, but they were greeted with the same respect, the same warmth as anyone else. And slowly, Boston Luxury Motors began to heal. Sales didn't rebound overnight, but the ones that did come were sturdier, built on relationships instead of manipulation. More importantly, loyalty deepened. Clients became advocates, recommending the dealership not because it was the most glamorous, but because it was the most genuine. One afternoon, a familiar figure walked through the showroom doors. Alexis Carter. This time she wasn't dressed for battle. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a soft smile that carried no bitterness. Daniel spotted her first, his face lighting up with recognition. He hurried over, extending a hand warmly. "Welcome back, Alexis," he said. She shook his hand, her grip strong and sure. "Just browsing today," she said lightly, "but I had to see it for myself." Daniel nodded, understanding without needing to ask. They walked through the showroom together. Alexis noticed the small but telling changes, the multilingual signs welcoming all customers, the children's play area in the corner, the employee badges that read not just names but values, respect, integrity, dignity. She smiled. "You've come a long way," she said. Daniel shrugged modestly. "Still a long way to go," he admitted, "but we're moving forward, one step at a time." Alexis paused, looking around. "That's what matters," she said. Before she left, she turned back to Daniel. "Tell Blake Thompson," she said softly, "if you ever see him, tell him change is possible, but it's a choice, every single day." Daniel nodded, and as Alexis Carter walked out into the bright Boston afternoon, Boston Luxury Motors, battered, humbled, and reborn, stood tall in the spring sunlight. Not perfect, but better. And for the first time, it was a place where dignity wasn't reserved for the few. It belonged to everyone who dared to walk through its doors. Underneath the bright Boston sky, a legacy was quietly taking root at Boston Luxury Motors. Not a legacy of polished marble floors or glittering car displays, but something far more resilient, the rebirth of human dignity. The collapse had been necessary. The rebuilding had been grueling. But the lasting change, the true legacy, was only just beginning to unfold. Blake Thompson's fall from grace had been brutal, yet even he, from a distance, had found a new path. Months after leaving the dealership, Blake volunteered full-time at the Carter Foundation, working alongside children like Thomas, the boy who had once cracked open his hardened heart with a simple act of kindness. Gone was the man who had measured worth by designer brands or polished appearances. In his place stood someone quieter, humbler, a man learning that true success had nothing to do with sales numbers or social status. He spoke at community events now, telling his story honestly, how arrogance, unchecked, could destroy not just careers, but souls. How dignity, once lost, could only be restored through humility, through service, through daily acts of kindness unseen by cameras or applause. And every time Blake spoke, he credited one name above all others: Alexis Carter. The young woman who had endured humiliation without letting it define her, who had stood her ground with a quiet strength that shattered walls thicker than any bank vault. Alexis herself had moved on too. She graduated from Westridge Academy at the top of her class, delivering a stirring commencement speech that left many in tears. "Respect isn't a gift you earn from others," she said that day, her voice steady. "It's the foundation you build within yourself. And when you carry that foundation proudly, no one, not prejudice, not arrogance, not injustice, can ever tear it down." Her words traveled far beyond that small stage, shared across social media, quoted in newspapers, even printed on posters in classrooms across Boston. Alexis had become, without intending to, a symbol of quiet revolution, proof that dignity, when fiercely protected, could transform even the most broken institutions. Meanwhile, Daniel Miller continued to lead Boston Luxury Motors with unwavering integrity. Under his leadership, the dealership became more than a place to buy luxury vehicles. It became a beacon for what real luxury meant: treating every single person who walked through the doors with honor, no matter what. The staff changed, not just in demographics, but in heart. Workshops continued. Perspective days expanded. Richard Mason, once the epitome of cold elitism, personally mentored new hires, emphasizing values before profits. Business ironically boomed. Not because of flashy ads, but because the truth traveled. Quietly, steadily. People trusted Boston Luxury Motors again, not because it was the most expensive, but because it was the most sincere. And in a world hungry for sincerity, that was rarer and more precious than any luxury good. Every year on the anniversary of Alexis's visit, the dealership hosted a Day of Dignity, a celebration not of wealth, but of resilience. Students from underprivileged schools were invited to tour the showroom, learn about financial literacy, and dream without limits. No one was judged by their shoes. No one was sized up by their clothes. It was a simple, radical declaration. You belong here, always. Standing under the banners that read respect, integrity, dignity, Daniel often found himself thinking back to that day, the day a simple teenage girl had stood alone against a sea of contempt and quietly refused to bow. That single act had changed everything. Not through shouting, not through lawsuits or rage, but through an unyielding, quiet refusal to be diminished. It had taught them all, Blake, Richard, the staff, the customers, even Marcus Carter himself, that justice was not just about punishment, it was about awakening, about offering a second chance to those willing to take it, and about understanding that true cultural change was not a moment, but 1,000 moments, choices made in silence, when no one was watching. Boston Luxury Motors was no longer just a dealership. It was a testament. That dignity, once rediscovered, could not only heal individuals, it could rebuild entire systems. And the true measure of success, in the end, was never found in profit margins. It was found in the quiet certainty that when faced with prejudice and injustice, they had chosen to change, truly, deeply, permanently. They had chosen to remember, to honor, to rebuild. One handshake at a time, one customer at a time, one heart at a time. And that was the moral legacy Alexis Carter had given them all. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.